Welcome to Healing Words, brought to you by the Dolores Jean Lavin Center for Humanities and Medicine at Mayo Clinic. I'm Jacquelyn Fletcher. On today's show, I'll be chatting with Andy Steiner, the author of How to Survive, The Extraordinary Resilience of Ordinary People. Andy is a writer and editor in St. Paul, Minnesota, and for her new book, she interviewed people who experienced a variety of different traumas, including a runner who had a heart attack, a woman whose husband had a stroke, and a man who lost both hands and an eye when a bomb went off in a package sent to his home. The stories are sad and real, hopeful and helpful. I'm excited to hear what Andy has to say, so let's get right to it. Andy, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for being here. I want to first find out something, because in your introduction to the book, you had this wonderful part where you said, I thought when I started writing this book that it was not for me. This book was not for me, but I found that actually it was for me. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Right. Well, you know, when I first started writing this book, it was about people who lived through traumatic life events, and I thought, I'm a reporter, and I'm looking at things from an objective point of view, so it's not going to be about me. But it turned out that actually the book was about me, and really about a lot of different people, and it turns out everybody goes through something. And so there's a lot that we can all learn from this, and a lot we can teach each other.
Yeah, I found that was really true when I was reading through all of the stories, just how universal so many of these coping skills are that you wrote about. But I would like to start with a story that was a little bit more dramatic than most ordinary people. Would you tell us about Father Lapsley?
Sure. Father Michael Lapsley is an Episcopalian priest who lives in South Africa. He, during the 1980s, during the anti-apartheid movement, he was an anti-apartheid activist, and he received what he call a parcel bomb, the letter bomb. A letter came in the mail. It was between the pages of a magazine, and when he opened it up, it exploded, and as you were saying, he lost both of his hands and his eye. He was also deaf, became deaf in one of his ears. He had to survive this event. This was a physical trauma that happened to him, so part of his survival was just living through the physical trauma of having these things happen to him. He was sent away to recover, and during that period of time, he had to decide if he was going to define his life by this horrible thing that had happened to him, or if he was going to move on and make something of it, sort of incorporate it into his life. And he decided to do that, to make something of what happened to him and incorporate it into his life. He later then became, continued his activism and started an organization called the Institute for Healing of Memories, which is really involved in trying to heal South Africa as a nation, and sort of based on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, sort of that kind of work, yeah.
Wow, well, and I thought it was, because you used that story in the introduction, and it so beautifully just set the stage for really the decision that we all have to make. I mean, you have stories in here about bankruptcy and losing your job and how to survive really anything, but that it all kind of comes down to that. I thought it was one of his quotes here I just wanted to read briefly. Think of life being like a river. The river flows unencumbered until this terrible thing happens, this thing that defines us as a victim. When trauma happens, when we don't move on, we become a stone in the river. The water whirlpools over and around us, but we ourselves are stuck. We live only in terms of that moment in history. And I love that in his story, he made a decision. He made a decision not to be that stone in the river. And that brings me to the story of Carrie Sparling, who is the woman who she had type 1 diabetes from age 6, so living with chronic illness. And tell me a little bit about what were her coping methods?
Yeah, so Carrie has spent all of her life that she remembers, basically, with diabetes, and has had to work hard to maintain her health. and she's decided to incorporate that into who she is. She really started blogging, which was a really big part of how she coped with realizing that she was a young person who has a chronic illness and really had to live with that. Her husband really encouraged her to do that, and when she started doing that, she started to meet people, learn more about it, because she had heard only very dire stories about what it was like to have type 2 diabetes, and she wanted to be a young person and live a life and still have fun, basically. And so she was able to do that, and while doing that, she learned a lot of things from other people that she met online about how to cope with her chronic illness, and she became really a well-known activist. Her blog is very popular in the diabetes community, and she's learned a lot of different ways to have fun. Just she talks about how she met her husband. She had her insulin pump, and she has had it sort of sitting on, it's kind of poking out the side of her jeans, and he said, "Do you have a pager?" You know, and she said, "No, it's not a pager. That's my pump." And they kind of got to know each other that way. Yeah.
Oh, I love that. Well, and I loved her, you talked a little bit in there about she really had this rebellious spirit, you know, where she wasn't going to let this disease define what she could and couldn't do, and she really did kind of had this rebelliousness, and I love where, this is one of her quotes, "When it came to dating, diabetes was a good barometer for jerks," she says. "If you're not cool with it, it's like hating my mom. For me, it's a deal breaker."
Right.
I just loved that.
Right. Yeah, she was able to say, "This is who I am, and if you can't accept that part about me, then you're just not the right person for me." I mean, and that's why the person she ended up marrying, her husband, was the right person for her. Just that little moment of like he saw this thing sticking out of her jeans, and when she said it was, "Oh, that's my pump," his reaction was, "Oh yeah, my friend's girlfriend has one of those too." So then she thought, okay, he's not freaking out about this, then it must be okay.
Yeah, he's going to be all right.
Yeah.
Well, and the other part of this story that I find really intriguing is that multiple stories throughout the book had people who, because we've talked about this on the show before, where people will use something traumatic that's happened to them for good. And I love that she did that too. She not only with this online community and her activism around it in talking about her illness, she also found a community, she found meaning behind what she was going through, which I find very, very compelling. Yeah.
Community is really important, and it's an ongoing theme in all of the stories in my book, that people find community either through being online, the web has really been a big place, but also just through support groups, people that meet, neighbors. It's really important.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's also a section in the book about for widowers, how to survive the death of a spouse. And there were several, I think 2 people in that section who also started groups for support. But I wanted to talk a little bit about Mary.
Okay.
So Mary is a woman who lost her husband in a car crash. They were in it together.
Right.
And their son was also in the car.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. And there was, you know, and she talked a lot about really beautiful coping skills that she used in the early years. But this one just really struck me. She said, "No matter what horrible blows you've been dealt, your happiness lies in your own hands. I know that things don't always go the way we've planned, but I do think that your happiness depends on your own actions. I'm going to choose to be happy and make life decisions that will move me in that direction." Wow.
Yeah, well, and I have to say that for Mary, she's very honest, and everyone in my book was very amazing and so willing to tell me their stories so openly and honestly. Her honesty is just that she shows that it takes a long time for her to heal from this. Her husband was taken away from her instantly, and she and her son had to figure out how to live their lives. She talked a lot about it took time, but then with time, she was able to survive, and by the end of the chapter, she's dating, which was years. I mean, it's not immediate, but she and her son have moved on from the house where they live with her husband and his father. But she's coping and coming up with ways to be okay.
Yeah. Well, and I loved that it was real. You know, because I think, especially, and I think that's why this passage really just jumped out at me so strongly, because, you know, we're all supposed to be happy and we're all supposed to get over things really fast. Right. But I loved this because it really, for me, how I read that was that A, it's a choice, and B, then there's action steps to make your life happier by what you're doing, you know, and that it empowers you to actually do something and to take those little steps that, you know, will get you to feeling better. I just thought that was just so powerful. You know, and so the stories really range from a 37-year-old woman who has a heart attack she's a runner, to a couple that lose their home after they invested in a business that was a lifelong dream, to a woman who had lost her job and had been without a job for 4 years. And I'm just curious to know, as you were interviewing all of these people, these ordinary, extraordinary people, were there any common themes that you saw?
Well, it is the community theme is really important to say, that people really just finding community, whatever way that was, support. Other common themes, it's just a sense of one foot in front of the other. That's something that people really feel like they have to do. And it's somewhat a generational thing, but really it turns out that it's not really a generational thing. People who are hit with an amazing trauma, they may be knocked out for a little bit, but they're going to have to brush themselves off and keep going if they're going to survive. Resilience, I believe, is something that we all have the capacity to have. It's not an inborn characteristic. It's actually something that I think is learned. We all have the potential to be there. And if we can take that next step, we can actually survive. And I think that's what the survivors that I talk to in my book have in common. That's something.
Well, that was my next question, so you stole it right off my cue, my index card here. But I was just curious because, you know, what your definition of resiliency is, and I'd love to hear you say more about, you think it's a learned thing. So where do we learn resiliency? How do we learn it?
I think it's from the people we're around, it's the communities in which we live, it's our family histories. I was raised by older parents. My parents were older when I was born. And they are World War II generation people who lived through tough times. I mean, my father, you know, lived through the Great Depression and was in a poor farming family. My mother lived in England during World War II, and she grew up with bombs and threats and rations and family living in her house. It was a constant trauma for her. These people are some of the most optimistic and forward-thinking people I can think of. I really admire them, and I think that that's something. Just learning from them is some way I can get resilient, and I think that's something that other people learn from their families too.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's great. So then, with your experience with family members who've been through things, with your own experience at, you know, going through traumatic things, as you were doing this research for this book, what story was the most personally compelling for you? What really hit home?
You know, it's funny actually, one that really hit home for me physically, or just sort of I thought about it a lot, was hearing the story, you mentioned her a little bit, Jen, who was the 37-year-old who had the heart attack, or maybe she was 38, I can't remember at the time. Getting to know Jen, I spent a lot of time interviewing her. She was a woman who had no reason to believe she was going to have a heart attack. Her father had bypass surgery, but that was when he was in his 50s. And she did have some warning sign of high cholesterol, but she was working on that too. But she was incredibly physically able and fit, and had a heart attack, sort of came out of what felt like nowhere. I mean, she'd been training for her second marathon and was going to do a triathlon as well. And in training, started to have some pain between her shoulder blades, actually, when she was out on longer runs. But she didn't know anything. That didn't sound like typical heart attack pain. She could feel herself sort of slowing down. She didn't have the same sense of stamina that she had had before. Still, she figured she wasn't eating enough, maybe before she ran. She went for dinner one night and with her friend and had spicy Thai food. And when she got home, she really had what she thought was like the worst heartburn she'd ever had in her life. And as it turned out, the night progressed, it didn't get any better, and she still didn't know. The next morning she drove herself to the emergency room, and eventually, after hours in the emergency room, was found out she had major blockage and was having a heart attack. So learning this and hearing her story, and then actually while I was in the process of interviewing Jen for this book, Jen actually had another blockage and was hospitalized again and had to have more work done. So it was really just listening to this and hearing how this was not a typical heart attack, I started to feel like I was going to have a heart attack. I mean, there were moments, and I write about this in my book, where I really thought, what's going on here? I'm having pains in my chest. This isn't good. I went to the doctor and had myself checked out. And it turned out, no, I wasn't having a heart attack. I was fine. But yeah, that really did affect me, and I really felt it. And the funny thing is, other people who've read my book have had similar experiences. I have a good friend who had a similar experience as well. So yeah, I think there's something about that sense of you really get drawn into someone's story, and it does really, really connect.
Stories are powerful.
Yeah, they are.
They're really powerful. And so is trauma, and you talk about that trauma doesn't discriminate.
No.
I mean, it really visits us all. We have all visit the kingdom of pain during the course of our lives and multiple times. Mm-hmm. And, what I love about the book too is that, you are really using the art of storytelling to show us things, show us other lives, to show us other worlds, so we don't have to go through all of them, but we still get to leave with those coping skills, which I think is really some of the beautiful, powerful reason why we're doing this show at all, is that words are incredibly healing, and stories. I wanted to bring up Joe Nelson. Okay. Who's a psychologist. He's got a private practice, and he works primarily with people who have chronic illness and diabetes. And I loved that he's got a favorite poem by Rumi called The Guest House. Right. And so I'm just going to take a quick peek at it here.
I don't know it by heart, so I'm glad you're
Yeah,
ready.
no,
Yes.
we'll take a quick peek.
Okay.
It says, "This being human is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival. A joy, a depression, a meanness. Some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture. Still treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight." It goes on from there, but I just loved how he said he loved that poem so much because it allowed people to talk about things that sometimes we don't talk about. Right. So can you kind of talk a little bit about that? Like, what do you think is so healing about talking about something that's hard?
It can be very hard to talk about something that's hard. I mean, what I think the interesting thing about that poem, and I think that's part of what Joe talks to his patients about, is that you need to take these traumas and understand that this is what we have. This is what we're experiencing right now, right? And that by talking about it, by reflecting on it, we have the opportunity to learn from it, to welcome them in to our lives and see what we're going to be when we come through the other side. Mm-hmm. I don't believe, though, that when you're in a trauma that it's all over and the sun comes up and you walk and everything's beautiful. I mean, you were always changed, but those changes may actually be okay. It's sort of on the cover of my book, there's a heart, right? There's a picture of a heart that's been stitched up, right? So you think, well, it's been broken, obviously, and somebody's sort of hand stitched it together, but that's all right. I've learned in the process of writing this book and being on TV and talking to people that when you break a bone, maybe someone who's a doctor will tell me this isn't true, but I've been told that when you break a bone, that the bone then actually where it's been broken is stronger, right? So it's sort of like that, it's this opportunity to make yourself into a different person or a stronger person or a new and improved person through the trauma that you experience.
That reminds me of, there was a line that the woman who was unemployed for 4 years, she said, "I realize now that I'm a better person than before, I'm a better person than I was before I lost my job." And that reminds me, we've talked a lot on the show about a guy named James Pennebaker. He did a lot of research on writing and healing and the power of storytelling and confession. And it just absolutely reminds me of that. It's not a Pollyanna, life is great now. Right. It's just a deeper knowing sometimes, and that's enough. To your point, I mean, the stitch is still there, right? But that doesn't mean that life isn't more rich or more meaningful in some way. So thank you for that. That was just absolutely beautiful, the way that you said that. I would love to hear just kind of final question as we're wrapping things up. If you were to give us 3 kind of practices that you learned throughout this process of writing this book that people could go home with to kind of practice or to become more resilient? What would those 3 or 1 or 2 or those things be?
That's a good question. Well, I do think it is about, I've already said this many times, but it is about creating community, finding people, reaching out. And it might be some of the people created their own community in the strangest ways, really, you know, just blogging or saying, I want to pull together a support group from people who read a column that I wrote in the newspaper, you know, that kind of thing. So that's one thing. Being willing to accept the fact that things aren't always going to be perfect all the time, and understand that all the time we're sort of making it up as we go along. I feel like I have to say that all the time because I don't know the right way to do things, and that's another thing. What's another thing? Taking time, I suppose, just to people, okay, for instance, somebody I talked to who dealt with unemployment, he said, I just needed to take some time away from what my trauma was and not spend all of my time thinking about that. I needed to go to a museum instead of spend every day trying to find a job. I needed to take time off like I was working at a regular job and just take a break and go to the museum and look at beautiful pictures. That would be another good example.
That's great, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So the Healing Words show is an extension of the Creative Writing at the Bedside program here at Mayo. And so one of the things that we do is offer writing prompts to people who are watching the show. And I would love to have you offer a prompt for the patients and caregivers who are watching.
Okay. So I would say that maybe you should ask people to imagine that think about a traumatic experience in their life. And think about a little bit about what they did and the strategies they used to survive that event. Then take time to write about yourself as if you were another person in the third person and say, this is how, whatever your name is, got through this traumatic event. This is what they did to do it. And then they'll have a good way to review sort of the strategies that you used to survive.
So they're basically in your seat, because you're the interviewer normally, aren't
Yeah,
you?
right,
so they'll
exactly.
be interviewing themselves.
Right.
That's great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And so now I would love to have you give us a few more examples of some stories by reading some of your work.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
You're welcome. This is from the afterword of my book, where I talk about how writing this book affected my life. And then my own life and the lives of my loved ones took a surprising turn. Within a span of months, my beloved father-in-law and niece both fell ill and died. I was with them both just hours before they passed, and the memories of that sacred time will remain with me forever. Thinking about their deaths still makes me feel hollowed out and sad. Those they left behind continue to struggle to come to peace with their untimely exits. In the muddle of my own grief, there were days when working on the book left me feeling depleted and exhausted. But as I continued to transcribe interviews and write, something unexpected happened. As I replayed the stories I collected during my research and writing, a sense of peace began to seep into the cracks of my life. My subjects' honest accounts of how they imperfectly yet bravely faced down life-shifting events were both awe-inspiring and comforting. These were real people who found that they could thrive despite major traumas. If they could do it, then so could I. I'm no Pollyanna. Reading other people's stories didn't bring me out of these experiences feeling instantly healed or anything like that, but knowing the stories of other people's struggles and survivals made me feel like my own struggles were somehow surmountable. And that was the reason I wrote this book in the first place. I wanted to help other people find a way through their own traumas by reading about the coping skills of others. When I experienced my own traumatic events, my subject stories had the effect I was hoping for. I felt less alone. Sure, life would be easier if we could just all sail through it, free of struggle or sadness. Like most people, that's the kind of life I once hoped for. And there's still part of me that wishes that life for my daughters. But I know that an unblemished life is incomplete. I recently came across a quote from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, author of On Death and Dying. The quote is, the most beautiful people we have known are those who have known defeat, known suffering, known loss, and found their way out of the depths. Beautiful people do not just happen. I love that sentiment because it says what I believe for years. The most compassionate people are those who've struggled. A good example is my own mother, a small, strong woman who survived a wartime childhood in England during the 1940s. As her relatives were bombed out of Bath, Bristol, and London, they all moved to Oxford to live with my mother, her two sisters, and their parents in their small row house. My mom ate meager portions of ration food, gave up her bed to her grandmother and aunt, and slept on a series of cots and couches. She remembers a childhood of air raids and gas masks, of listening anxiously for the ominous put-put sound of buzz bombs. Still, she survived it all to become a gentle, gracious woman, welcoming and kind to everyone who came through her door. Even today, as her eyesight fades and she struggles with the painful reality of my 92-year-old father's advancing dementia, my mother continues to find great joy in nature, in the presence of her children and grandchildren, and the comforting rhythm of her favorite poetry. My mom has always been particularly fond of The Velveteen Rabbit, a children's story in which a once plush stuffed toy becomes real only after having his whiskers loved off. She read it to me when I was a child. Later, when I was in college, I gave a copy to the man who would one day become my husband. The message? It's simple, and one I relearned while struggling in the tangle of writing this book. Life, while it can be filled with joyful moments, can also wear us down, but that's what makes us beautiful and real.
One powerful tool people use to survive traumatic experiences is to write and tell stories. Last weekend, for example, I attended a memorial for a dear friend's father who passed suddenly. During the service, people told story after story about this man's life, and most of them were really funny, so we laughed a lot, and we cried too. With the stories, we were able to access our emotions and share them with each other. The stories connected our hearts, so all the people in the room were suddenly family too. Then at the reception afterward, we were all asked to take an index card and write a story of our own experience with this man to share with his adult daughters. I wrote about the first time I met him when I saw his huge exuberance for life, and I wrote about how clearly his daughters lived his commitment to see the humanity in all people. The memorial was powerful and healing, but it was also community building because of those stories. I believe it made us all more resilient when we returned to our lives. So let's try the index card story exercise. I'd like you to write a short story, only a paragraph or two, or however many lines you think would fit on an index card, and think about someone in your life who's gone through something hard. Write about what happened to them and how they've survived it. What lesson did that person teach you about how you might be able to approach some current or future challenge? What coping methods did they use? Write down as many details as you can, even if you just write a list of words about that moment. That's a place to start. As you play with the exercises in today's show, I hope you'll realize just how extraordinary you are. Thank you so much for watching Healing Words, brought to you by the Dolores Jean Lavin Center for Humanities and Medicine at Mayo Clinic. I'm Jackie Fletcher. If you'd like to try some of the exercises you've heard today, you can ask your nurse to contact us and we'll get you a notebook and a pen. You can reach me with any thoughts or suggestions or arrange to have a writer visit you in your room by using the contact information on the screen. I'd like to send out a big thank you to Andy for joining me today and for sharing her stories with us. You can find her book, How to Survive the Extraordinary Resilience of Ordinary People, on her website at andysteiner.com. That's ANDYSTEINER.com. You can also watch more episodes of Healing Words on demand or streaming live on the Humanities channel during your stay at Mayo Clinic. And if you do plan to watch our show, have something to write with ready to go so you can experience the healing power of words. Until next time, be well.